He was a craftsman whose name was unknown, a man who spent his days in quiet conversation with wood. On the world's grandest stage, he presented his masterwork, a violin that held the very soul of his family. But the most celebrated maestro on the planet looked at him with disdain and, before the eyes of the world, accused him of being a fraud. And just as the craftsman's world was about to shatter, his 8-year-old son stepped forward, altering everyone's destiny with a single question. Sovereign Hall, home of the Sterling Bow International Competition, was a sanctuary. The air smelled of aged wood and heavy expectation, a nearly sacred silence punctuated only by muffled coughs. On stage, bathed in the intense glow of the spotlights, Caleb Evans, a man of calloused hands and simple clothes, held his violin as if it were his own child. At the judges' table, Maestro Julian Croft, a living legend of classical music, watched with an air of arrogant boredom, his eyes scanning the competitors like a king inspecting worthless peasants. When Caleb finally placed his instrument on the velvet-topped table, a profound hush fell over the room. The maestro leaned in, his eyes narrowing. He rose, strode to the stage, picked up Caleb's violin with the tips of his fingers, and held it up to the light. Then, with a cruel smirk aimed at the audience, he declared loudly, "This violin is a forgery, and I will prove it." In that moment, Caleb's heart stopped. Caleb Evans's life wasn't measured in hours, but in layers of varnish. His workshop, a cramped, dust-mote-filled room at the back of a modest house, was his entire universe. The scent of cedar and spruce was the perfume of his existence. The sound of wood being carved by time-worn tools was his only music. He wasn't just a luthier, a builder of violins. He was the keeper of secrets, whispered to him by his grandfather, a master who believed every tree held a song, and that the craftsman's job was merely to set it free. He spoke with the wood, feeling its grain, its knots, its imperfections, treating each piece not as an inanimate object, but as a living being with its own memories and potential. His son, Leo, 8 years old, grew up in this silent sanctuary. He was a quiet boy with observant eyes who played not with toy cars, but with wood shavings his father gave him. He didn't just hear his father's words, he listened to the sound of his tools, learning to distinguish the gentle rasp of the plane from the precise slice of the chisel. He saw how Caleb treated every piece of wood with an almost holy reverence and understood, without needing an explanation, that his father's work wasn't about making instruments, but about giving the forest a voice. The routine was a constant rhythm, waking before sunrise, working the wood with a monk's patience, and at the end of the day, sitting with Leo on the porch, telling stories not of people, but of ancient, wise trees. But this peaceful routine carried a quiet ambition, a dream Caleb nurtured in secret, to create one perfect violin, using a wood treatment technique his family swore was magic. A process that took years and that other luthiers dismissed as a myth. When the announcement for the Sterling Bow competition arrived, the most prestigious contest of its kind in the world, Leo saw a different light in his father's eyes. It was a chance, not for fame or money, but for validation, a chance to prove that his grandfather's magic was real. With their life savings, they entered. And it was there, in that decision driven by a silent dream, that everything began to fall apart. Caleb's desire wasn't for the gold trophy or the prize money that came with it. He barely thought about them. His longing was deeper, almost spiritual, woven into the very fabric of his identity. It was about honoring a silent promise made years ago to his grandfather on his deathbed, a promise that the voice of the forest, the name they gave their secret wood treatment technique, would not die with him, would not become just a story told in whispers. The technique was a family heirloom, a ritual passed down through generations that bordered on mysticism. They didn't just cut down wood. They saw it as raw material. They harvested it. Caleb and his grandfather would walk through ancient forests, searching for noble trees that had fallen naturally, brought down by wind or the weight of time. They believed that by dying a natural death, The tree kept its life force, its soul, intact within the wood. To the modern world of luthiers, with their climate-controlled kilns and laser measurements, this was pure superstition, peasant folklore. To Caleb, it was the essence of his art. The drying process was an exercise in patience. The wood wasn't placed in ovens, but in a dark, airy shed where it would rest for years, sometimes decades, curing slowly with the rhythm of the seasons. Caleb learned to listen to the wood, to know when it was ready just by touching it, feeling its subtle resonance. And the varnish was the final secret, a complex mixture of rare resins, sap from specific trees, and oils for which only they knew the formula. His grandfather used to say the varnish didn't just protect the wood, it awakened its soul, allowing it to sing with the voice it had in life. Caleb spent 20 years of his life working on the violin he would take to the competition. Every curve, every carving was not just technically perfect, but laden with meaning and history. The wood for the top came from a spruce his grandfather had found decades ago, a tree that had survived a forest fire, and, according to him, held the resilience of the flames in its grain. The back came from a maple that grew beside a creek, and Caleb swore that on quiet days he could hear the soft sound of running water in the wood's resonance. He wasn't building an instrument, he was joining the souls of trees into a single body. His deepest wish was that for a single moment, the world of music, so obsessed with famous names like Stradivari and Guarneri, so focused on established traditions and rigid rules, would hear that sound. He wanted a great musician, upon playing his violin, to feel what he felt. The wind in the leaves, the smell of damp earth, the history of a family that had dedicated their lives to hearing what the wood had to say. It was a quest for recognition, not for himself, but for the invisible legacy he carried in his hands. Winning the sterling bow would mean that his grandfather's voice, the voice of the forest, would echo forever in the great concert halls of the world. And for a simple man like Caleb, that was more valuable than all the gold in the world. It was the immortality of his artisan soul. The road to the competition was the first trial, an ordeal by fire that began long before they ever set foot on the stage. The entry fee, a staggering sum by Caleb's standards, consumed nearly all his savings, the money he kept for an emergency or for Leo's future. To make up the difference, he had to make a decision that broke his heart, selling some of his best tools. These weren't ordinary tools, they were extensions of his hands, inherited from his grandfather, each with a wooden handle polished by decades of use, each carrying the memory of countless hours of work. Selling those pieces was like selling a part of his history, a silent sacrifice whose depth only he and Leo understood. The 2-day bus ride was long and grueling, a world away from the luxury that surely surrounded the other competitors. While he imagined his rivals arriving in comfortable cars or on swift flights, Caleb and Leo shared a cramped seat, the violin case occupying the space of a third person. Caleb refused to check it or put it in the luggage compartment. He held it tightly through the turns, shielded it from the sun coming through the window, treating it not as an object, but as the most important passenger on that journey. Leo, in silence, watched his father's dedication, understanding that the case held much more than an instrument. It held their dream, their honor, and their future. In their simple, cheap hotel on the edge of the city, far from the glitter and glamour of the downtown where the competition took place, anxiety began to gnaw at Caleb's confidence. At night, he would scroll through the internet on his phone, reading interviews and articles about the other competitors. They were men in white lab coats, posing in workshops that looked like high-tech laboratories. They spoke in jargon Caleb barely understood: spectral analysis of the tone wood, next-generation synthetic varnishes, 3D printing of components. They had sponsors, logos of famous companies on their aprons. Caleb had his hands, his sole tools, and a family secret that, in the light of this overwhelming modernity, began to feel naive, almost foolish. On the day of the preliminary presentation, the tension was palpable. The conservatory hallways were filled with men in suits, laughing loudly, showing off their instruments like hunting trophies. When Caleb, in a quiet corner, opened his case for an initial inspection, one of the competitors, a man with an arrogant face and expensive shoes, glanced over his shoulder and let out a derisive laugh. "Brave of you to bring firewood to the competition," he scoffed, referring to the organic, non-industrial look of Caleb's wood. "Maybe it'll be good for lighting the maestro's fireplace." Caleb felt his face burn, a humiliation that made him shrink inside. He closed the case, but the insult hung in the air. Leo, beside him, squeezed his hand tightly, a small gesture of giant loyalty. Later, during the acoustic rehearsals, Caleb saw Maestro Julian Croft in person for the first time. The man was a storm of charisma and contempt. He walked past the instruments, barely glancing at them, his disdain and almost physical force. And then the second arrow struck. A event organizer, noticing Caleb's worn clothes, approached him with an expression of false politeness. "Excuse me, sir," the man said, looking him up and down. "The service entrance is around back. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Every word, every glance, was a small cut, undermining the courage it had taken him a lifetime to build. The moment came. Caleb's name, Caleb Evans, was called with a cold formality that clashed with the warmth of his workshop. He walked to the center of the stage, each footstep echoing in the silence of Sovereign Hall. The spotlights were hot and blinding, turning the audience into a shapeless mass of shadows and figures. He placed the violin on the black velvet table with a gentleness that bordered on prayer, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. But only one gaze mattered. Julian Croft rose slowly, a rehearsed movement that drew all attention to himself. He approached the stage, not with the hurry of a judge, but with the cadence of a leading actor. He circled the table, his Italian leather shoes gleaming, his hands clasped behind his back like a general inspecting a questionable weapon. The silence was total, thick. He picked up the violin. His touch was different from Caleb's. It was not a touch of reverence, but of possession, of judgment. It was the touch of a man who felt he owned everything his eyes landed on. He turned it over, analyzing the carving of the scroll, the color of the varnish, the texture of the wood. Then he turned to the audience, and a slow, condescending smile spread across his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his baritone voice filling the hall without needing a microphone. "We have here a classic and rather sad example of ambition outweighing talent." Murmurs rippled through the audience, a buzz of curiosity and malice. "This craftsman," he said, pausing dramatically without even looking at Caleb, treating him like an object of study, "would have us believe this is an original work, a piece of rustic genius, perhaps a lost treasure found in a barn." He paused again, savoring the power he held over every person in that hall. "But I know this work. I recognize every line, every curve, every subtle flaw. Because this violin, ladies and gentlemen, is a copy. A cheap copy of one of my own early designs. A design I myself abandoned over 30 years ago for being fundamentally flawed." The accusation fell like a stone into the silence. Plagiarism, fraud, the ultimate heresy. The worst possible offense for an artist who had dedicated his life to originality. The air grew thin. Caleb felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him pale, ice-cold. He wanted to scream that it was a lie, that this violin carried the soul of his grandfather, not the discarded drafts of another man. But his throat closed up, the words dying before they could be born. "This man," Croft continued, now pointing an accusing finger at Caleb, who stood paralyzed, exposed, "likely found some old sketches I threw away, used inferior wood, as you can see from the irregular grain, and applied some homemade varnish to create this forgery." The word forgery was pronounced with a cutting disdain that echoed through the hall. The audience, once silent, was now whispering openly. Some laughed, a cruel sound that pierced Caleb's heart. The contempt was a wave, swallowing him whole. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, but all that came out was an inaudible sound, a gasp of despair. His 20 years of work, his family's honor, his grandfather's legacy, all of it was being unraveled, stained and ridiculed in minutes. "It's a disgrace to this competition," Croft concluded, his voice now like a judge delivering a death sentence. He placed the violin back on the table with a dull thud, a sound of finality, of disposal, an insult to the memory of the great masters and to all the honest artisans present here. "Take this piece away." He turned and walked back to his seat at the table, dismissing Caleb with a wave of his hand, as if shooing an unwanted animal from his garden. Caleb stood there, alone on the stage, his face on fire, the dream of a lifetime turned to ash and dust. He no longer heard the whispers, no longer saw the faces. He was trapped in a bubble of humiliation and silence. With trembling hands, he picked up his violin, his life's work now labeled as trash, and walked off the stage, a ghost moving under the pitying and scornful gazes of a world to which he had never belonged. Away from the spotlights, the silence of an empty service corridor was more deafening than the noise of humiliation. Caleb leaned against the cold wall, the violin case heavy in his hand, as if he were carrying a coffin. The air seemed to have been stolen from his lungs. Each breath was a physical effort, a painful drag of oxygen into a body that felt hollowed out. Croft's words echoed in his mind, not as a shout, but as a slow poison, seeping into every part of his being. Forgery, cheap copy, fraud. He didn't feel anger. Anger requires energy, a sense of injustice that fights to assert itself. What Caleb felt was a deep void, an internal collapse. That violin wasn't just wood and varnish, it was the materialization of his grandfather, of his sleepless nights, of his soul. And all of it had been profaned, ridiculed, turned to garbage in front of the world. He felt dirty, an imposter, exactly as the maestro had painted him. His confidence, a tree he had spent decades cultivating in his solitary, honest work, had crumbled in minutes, turned to sawdust under the maestro's feet. Leo found him there, sitting on the cold concrete floor, his head between his knees, curled up as if trying to disappear. The boy said nothing. The wisdom of children sometimes lies in their silence. He just sat down next to his father, his small presence a fragile anchor in the storm of shame that ravaged Caleb. He rested his shoulder against his father's arm, a minimal contact that said everything. "I'm here. I see you. Let's go home, son," Caleb whispered, his voice hoarse, unrecognizable. "This isn't our place." He looked at his own hands, the same hands that knew how to draw music from wood, that knew the secrets of grains and resins. And for the first time in his life, he saw them as the hands of a failure. Thick, calloused, varnish-stained hands. The hands of a manual laborer who had dared to dream he belonged in that world of velvet and applause, and that world had spit him out. A false hope, weak and pathetic, flickered for an instant. Maybe the other judges, maybe they had seen the truth, but he knew it was useless. Julian Croft's word was law in that universe. No one would dare contradict him. The story was already written. He was no longer a competitor. He was a joke, a footnote in the competition's history. The anecdote they would tell at future dinners about the foolish craftsman who tried to trick the great maestro with a piece of varnished firewood. The promise he made to his grandfather. He had broken it. He hadn't just failed to honor his family's legacy, he had dragged it through the mud of public humiliation. He stood up, his body heavy, his soul heavier still. He was ready to disappear, to return to his workshop and never leave again. He just wanted oblivion, the silence of his wood, which had never judged him. But then he felt Leo's small hand grip his, with a strength that belied his size, and he heard footsteps approaching. They were light, hesitant steps. It was one of the event's sound technicians, a young man in his early 20s, with headphones hanging around his neck. He had seen everything from the wings, his face contorting in discomfort with every cruel word from the maestro. He approached, not knowing what to say, but feeling that silence would be complicity in the injustice. I'm so sorry," was all he could manage, the words coming out awkwardly. What he did, it wasn't right. The young man looked at the violin case with a reverence that contrasted violently with the maestro's contempt. "I heard its sound during the mic checks earlier. It's special." They were simple words, but in that desert of shame, they sounded like a glass of water. Have you ever felt invisible, even when giving your all and pouring your soul into something? Have you ever had your worth questioned by someone who doesn't even know you, someone who judges you without knowing your struggle, your sleepless nights? If you've ever felt that pain, that urge to give up, type "I fight on" in the comments, just so I know you understand what Caleb is feeling and that you're still here with me. Because true strength sometimes appears in the darkest moments. In the silent hallway, Caleb's shame was a heavy, suffocating cloak. The young sound tech's kind words were a momentary balm, but the wound was too deep. "Thank you," Caleb murmured, his voice barely audible. "But it's over now. Let's go, Leo," he repeated, his voice devoid of any emotion, the sound of a man who had already surrendered. He turned toward the dark corridor that led to the exit, the path of escape. But Leo didn't move. He stood still, looking at his father's devastated face, a face he had never seen like this, without the calm light of concentration, without the discreet smile of someone who loves what they do, and an unusual calm, a clarity that didn't belong to an 8-year-old washed over the boy. "Dad," Leo said, his voice small but cutting through the heavy silence of the hallway. "You haven't let it sing yet." Caleb stopped, froze. The simplicity of the question hit him harder than all the maestro's arrogance. "Sing," that's what he always told Leo in the quiet of the workshop. "We're not making an object, my son. We're teaching the wood to sing." He wasn't talking about sound, notes, or acoustics. He was talking about the instrument's soul, and in the midst of his own pain and humiliation, he had forgotten the most important thing. He had forgotten the music. Leo's question wasn't a demand. It was a reminder of the purpose, of the truth that existed long before the competition, long before the humiliation. The violin's soul was still there, untouched, waiting. The young sound technician, who was watching the scene, felt a lump in his throat. He had grown up in a family of musicians and recognized the pain of a wronged artist. But he also recognized truth when he heard it. Impulsively, moved by a wave of compassion and indignation, he stepped closer. "Sir," he said to Caleb, his voice now filled with a newfound urgency, "there's a rule in the competition, an old, almost forgotten clause. Every participant has the right to a final rebuttal. It's 3 minutes. Nobody ever uses it, because situations like this aren't supposed to happen. But it's in the regulations. You have the right to speak." Caleb shook his head, his gaze lost. "Say what? For what? To be humiliated again, so he can laugh one more time?" The fear of facing that stage again was greater than any desire for justice. "No," said Leo, with a firmness that surprised everyone. He took a step forward, placing himself between his father and the technician. He turned to the young man. "Not my dad, me." The idea was absurd. A child on stage. It would be a circus. But the technician, looking at the determined expression on the boy's face, a seriousness that contrasted with his childlike cheeks, made a decision that would change his life. He saw not a child seeking attention, but a son defending his father's honor. I'll talk to the stage manager," he said, the decision solidifying in his voice. "I can't promise anything, but the courage of a child. Sometimes people listen." He didn't finish the sentence. He just turned and ran towards the stage, leaving father and son alone in the corridor. Caleb looked at his son, stunned, the fog of his pain dissipating before Leo's incredible act. "Leo, what are you going to do? What will you say?" Leo turned to his father. His eyes, which had always been mirrors of Caleb's calm, now held a flame of their own. "I'm going to tell them the truth, Dad," Leo said with devastating simplicity. "The truth they can't see. the truth about your violin. The light of hope, which had seemed extinguished forever, rekindled in that cold hallway, not as a tall, crackling flame, but as a stubborn ember, glowing in the dark, fanned by the breath of a child who refused to let his father's music die in silence. The return to the stage was the longest, most frightening walk of Leo's life. The stage manager, a skeptical middle-aged man who was secretly touched by the bizarre situation, granted him the 3 minutes, more out of morbid curiosity than a sense of justice. The audience, already settling in for the next competitor, murmured in confusion as they saw the small figure of the child climb the steps alone, walking toward the center of the stage. Maestro Julian Croft, from his throne at the judges' table, huffed with impatience, annoyed by this bizarre interruption that only prolonged what he considered an unnecessary drama. Leo stopped at the center of the stage, under the same light that had humiliated his father. The microphone was too high, a metal giant pointing at the ceiling. The young sound technician, his only ally in this hostile universe, ran out and adjusted it, whispering a "You've got this," before disappearing back into the wings. The ensuing silence was heavy, hostile, charged with expectation and a hint of mockery. For a second, fear paralyzed him. He looked out at the hundreds of unknown faces, anonymous shadows in the darkness, and his heart raced, hammering in his ears. He looked for his father in the wings and saw his face, a mask of panic, hope, and terrified love. That look gave him strength. He took a deep breath, a small body inflating with courage. "My name is Leo," he said, his voice a little shaky, almost a whisper that barely reached the front row. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder. "My name is Leo. And that man over there," he pointed to Caleb, who was shrinking in the shadow of the wings, "is my dad. He's not a thief." His voice began to gain firmness, fueled by the conviction of his mission. He asked for the violin to be brought back to the stage, with a care that mirrored his father's gestures, a care that was an inheritance in itself. He picked it up. He didn't hold it like a musician, poised on his shoulder, ready to play. He held it in his arms like a storyteller would hold an ancient relic. "The maestro said this wood is inferior," Leo began, his voice echoing in the now attentive silence. "But this wood came from a spruce tree that my great-grandfather saw fall in a storm 80 years ago. My dad says the tree was so strong it kept the sound of that thunder inside it." He ran his small, delicate fingers over the light-colored wood of the top. "And this part here," he continued, turning the instrument and pointing to the flamed maple back, "he says it came from a tree that grew so slowly, so very slowly next to a creek, that it learned to be patient. And that its patience, the sound of the water, is in the music it makes." He wasn't talking about technique, wood density, or acoustics. He was talking about soul. He was talking about heritage. The audience, which had previously been sneering or looking on with pity, was now listening with hypnotic focus. The boy's words, so simple and pure, were beginning to disarm the hall's cynicism. He was transforming an object of dispute into a character, a being with a history, right before their eyes. "And the varnish," Leo said, bringing the violin closer to the light, making its amber color glow. "The maestro said it's homemade." "It is. My family has been making this varnish for 100 years. It's not chemicals. It's made from the resin of trees that weep and from the honey of bees that visit mountain flowers. My dad says it's not to make it shiny. It's to wake up the wood." With every sentence, the narrative shifted. It was no longer about an accusation of plagiarism. It was about a conflict between two worlds, the industrial, technical, and arrogant world of Croft, and the organic, spiritual, and humble world of Caleb. Leo, with his childlike wisdom, was exposing this truth. He wasn't trying to prove his father was a technically better luthier. He was proving that his father's work belonged to a dimension of value that money couldn't buy and arrogance couldn't see. The violin was no longer an object. It was a testament. And a slow transformation was happening, not on the stage, but in the minds and hearts of every person who listened. The hall's attention was entirely on Leo. He had redefined the object of the dispute, turning an accusation of fraud into a lesson on the soul of things. But words, however beautiful, wouldn't be enough to erase the stain of humiliation. He needed proof, an irrefutable moment that would transcend opinion and enter the realm of fact. The genius of his next move lay in its devastating simplicity. He wouldn't try to play his father's violin. He knew his childish skills wouldn't do justice to the instrument. Instead, he would use the enemy's own weapon, his greatest strength, against him. "Maestro Croft," Leo said, looking directly at the judges' table, his young voice now carrying the weight of a defense attorney, asking his final question. "You are considered by many to be the greatest violinist in the world, right?" Croft, caught off guard by the direct address and annoyed at being put on the spot by a child, just gave a curt, arrogant nod, a dry gesture that said, "Obviously." "And the violin you play," Leo continued, unintimidated, "is a Stradivarius, one of the most perfect ever made." It wasn't a question, but a statement, showing he'd done his homework. "Yes, boy. What's your point?" The maestro's voice was impatient, sharp. "Could you please play one note on your violin?" Leo asked, with a politeness that disarmed the maestro's aggression. Just one note. The note A. The audience held its collective breath. The boy's audacity was incredible. Asking the great Julian Croft to demonstrate his Stradivarius was like asking a king to show how his crown sparkled. Croft hesitated for a second, his eyes narrowing. He sensed a trap, but he didn't know what it was. To refuse, however, would be a sign of weakness, an admission that the boy was controlling him. With an impatient gesture and a look that promised retaliation, he picked up his own priceless violin, which gleamed under the lights. He positioned it perfectly, raised his bow, and played the note. The sound that filled the hall was the very definition of perfection. It was pure, crystalline, mathematically precise, a sound worth millions of dollars and centuries of reverence. The note hung in the air, flawless, and then vanished. "Thank you," said Leo, with a calmness that unnerved the maestro. "Now could you please play the same note on my father's violin?" Croft laughed, a sound of pure disdain. "What for, boy? So we can hear this tinny sound and compare it to perfection. What a waste of time." But the other judges were looking at him, their faces serious, and the audience was in absolute silence, a silence that demanded an answer. He was cornered. If he played, he was following a child's script. If he didn't, he would look like a coward. With a theatrical sigh of annoyance, he picked up Caleb's violin, holding it with his fingertips as if it were contaminated. But before he played, Leo made his final move, the one that would define everything. "Wait," he said, his voice clear and loud. "Before the maestro plays, I want you to listen for what you're about to hear. It won't be a perfect sound like the Stradivarius. It will be a different sound." He paused, ensuring every person was hanging on his words. "It will have a warmth, like afternoon sun on wood. It won't be as clean because it carries the tree's memories. And at the end of the note, if you listen very, very closely, you'll feel a tiny vibration, an echo that takes a little longer to die. My dad calls it the sigh of the tree. It's the proof that the wood is still alive." All eyes, including those of the other judges, were now fixed on Croft. The boy's prediction was so specific, so poetic, and so technical at the same time that it seemed impossible. Croft felt a drop of sweat trickle down his temple. This was madness, but he had no choice. He raised the bow, his face a mask of contempt that barely concealed his growing uncertainty. And then he played the same note A, and it happened. The sound that emerged from Caleb's violin wasn't the sound of an object. It was the sound of a life. It was exactly as Leo had described. It lacked the icy perfection of the Stradivarius, but it possessed a warmth that seemed to embrace the hall, a richness of tones and harmonics that the perfect sound couldn't achieve. It was complex. imperfect, and incredibly human. And then, as the main note began to fade, the miracle manifested. Subtle but unmistakable, there it was. A tiny secondary resonance, a vibration that lingered in the air for an extra second, a melancholic sigh that seemed to touch the soul of every person in the room. The sigh of the tree. It was real. A silence like that had never been heard in Sovereign Hall. It wasn't the silence of expectation or politeness. It was a dense, heavy silence, a vacuum created by the sudden collision of the impossible and the real. The note, with its final sigh, vanished into the air, but its echo remained, not in the ears, but in the hearts of the audience. No one moved. No one breathed. For an eternal instant, the entire world seemed to hold its breath along with that note. Maestro Julian Croft was frozen on stage, the bow still suspended in the air, his hand trembling slightly. His face, once a mask of arrogance and contempt, was now pale, disfigured by disbelief. His eyes, which moments before had blazed with scorn, were now wide, fixed on Caleb's violin as if looking at a ghost. He, the world's greatest expert, the man whose ear was considered the gold standard of music, had been exposed. And not by a rival, not by a critic, but by an 8-year-old child, and by a sound he had declared to be garbage. A sound that he, with all his genius, could not explain, but that Leo had predicted with terrifying, poetic accuracy. His mind, a palace of certainties and dogmas, was crumbling. Every pillar of his authority, built over decades of acclaim, was turning to dust before hundreds of witnesses. The other judges, sitting at their table, leaned forward, their faces a mixture of astonishment and admiration. One of the judges, a world-renowned violinist known for her cold, precise technique, had tears streaming freely down her face. She made no attempt to wipe them away. She looked toward the wings, searching for Caleb, and when her eyes found him, she gave a slight nod, a gesture of profound and unequivocal respect. It was an apology and an acknowledgement. They needed no more proof, no technical analyses, no debates. They had witnessed the impossible, they had heard the soul, and then the silence broke. It wasn't polite applause, it was an explosion, a thunderous ovation, a wave of sound that seemed to shake the conservatory's foundations. People rose to their feet in a single impulse, as if moved by one force, shouting, "Bravo, bravo!" Not for the maestro, but for the boy on stage and the invisible craftsman in the wings. The sound was a catharsis, a celebration of David's victory over Goliath, of truth over arrogance. It was the sound of liberation. Businessmen, musicians, critics, ordinary people, all united by that moment of pure emotion, applauding with a ferocity that was both a tribute and a protest against the humiliation they had witnessed. Julian Croft, finally waking from his stupor, looked at the standing audience, at the ecstatic faces, and reality hit him with the force of a punch. The applause wasn't for him. It was for his defeat. Humiliated, exposed, he dropped Caleb's violin on the velvet table as if it burned his skin. Without a word, without a glance at the other judges or the child who had destroyed him, he turned and walked hastily off the stage, almost running, his reputation shattered by the purity of a single musical note. That sound didn't just prove the violin's worth. It proved that Croft, with all his technical knowledge, was deaf to the soul of music. He wasn't just defeated, he was revealed. His escape was not that of a man in a hurry, but of a dethroned king fleeing his own burning castle. In the wings, Caleb watched it all, the tears he had held back for so long finally streaming down his face. But they were not tears of sadness or shame. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a love for his son so deep it ached. He saw the maestro flee, heard the unending ovation, and felt the weight of 20 years of doubt and solitary work lift from his shoulders. The validation he had sought, not for himself, but for his grandfather, his family, the wood itself, had finally arrived. And not in the way he had expected, but in a way far more powerful and meaningful. On stage, amidst the hurricane of applause, Leo remained calm. He didn't smile. He just watched, with the seriousness of someone who had completed an important task. He looked for his father in the darkness of the wings, and their eyes met. In that gaze, everything was said. Pride, love, gratitude. The world around them could roar, but in that instant, only the two of them existed, father and son, bound forever by that moment of courage and truth. The world's reaction wasn't just applause, it was a conversion. That night, no one left Sovereign Hall the same. They hadn't just watched a competition, they had witnessed a legend being born. As the ovation continued, Caleb walked slowly onto the stage, not as a victor marching to receive his crown, but as a pilgrim arriving at his shrine. He didn't look at the audience, didn't look at the judges. His eyes were fixed on Leo. He knelt before his son and hugged him, a hug that contained decades of silent work, fear, humiliation, and finally, redemption. The audience, sensing the sanctity of the moment, gradually quieted, the sound of applause fading to a respectful silence, eager to hear from the man behind the miracle. Caleb stood up, holding Leo's hand. He approached the microphone, and when he spoke, his voice was the same as always, calm, humble, with no trace of triumph or revenge. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you so much. But my son didn't prove that I'm a good craftsman. He just reminded everyone of something that, sometimes, in the noise of the world, we forget." He picked up his violin, this time with the reverence it deserved. The instrument now transformed into a relic before them all. We worry so much about the maker's name, the instrument's price, the perfection of the technique, the exact note. But music doesn't live in those things. It lives here, he said, gently touching the violin's wood with his fingertips. It lives in the patience of the tree that waited a century to grow. It lives in the dedication of the hands that shaped it. It lives in the history that each piece carries within it. His gaze swept across the hall, not seeing a crowd, but individuals. "My grandfather taught me that the best luthier isn't the one who imposes his will on the wood, forcing it to bow to his technique. The best luthier is the one who listens. The one who spends years in silence, just listening to what the wood wants to become. The job isn't to create a sound, but to release a sound that already exists. Today, you didn't hear my work. You heard the song of a tree that waited a very long time to be heard. The lesson hung in the air, simple and profound. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about authenticity, about a value that can't be measured in money or fame. It was about understanding that true art isn't a performance for the world, but an honest, silent dialogue with the soul of things. Caleb didn't need to attack Croft. He didn't need to mention the word fraud or lie. He just showed a more ancient and powerful truth, that dignity doesn't need applause to exist, though it appreciates it. And that true talent, the talent that touches the soul, blossoms in the silence of the workshop, not in the noise of self-promotion. Caleb's greatest victory wasn't proving his violin was good. It was proving that his world, the world of silence, patience, and listening, had inestimable value. Caleb Evans did not win the Sterling Bow Prize that year. The Golden Trophy, as the rules dictated, went to a technically flawless luthier, a man whose violin was a marvel of mathematical precision. But Caleb won something much greater: respect. He returned to his small workshop, not to anonymity, but to a new reality. In the following weeks, his old phone, which had rarely rung before, wouldn't stop. It was musicians from famous orchestras, art collectors, conservatory professors from all over the world. They didn't want a perfect instrument. They wanted an instrument with a soul. They wanted a Caleb Evans. His life didn't fill with luxury. He continued to live in the same modest house, using the same worn-out tools, but he never had to worry about selling them again. His waiting list for a violin made by his hands stretched for years, then for a decade. He became a silent legend, a master sought not by those chasing fame, but by those who understood the difference between sound and music. His greatest joy was knowing that his violins, the voices of the trees he had set free, were now singing in the world's greatest theaters, played by hands that understood and revered their history. Maestro Julian Croft was never the same. His arrogance, once seen as the eccentricity of a genius, now seemed like the fragile disguise of an empty man. The story of the tree's sigh spread like wildfire through the music world. His career continued. He was still a powerful name, but the magic had been broken. Critics began to re-evaluate his work, noting a coldness, a lack of warmth that had previously gone unnoticed. He became a footnote in Caleb's story, the expert who, in his arrogance, couldn't listen. The greatest irony was that in trying to destroy an unknown craftsman, he had ended up immortalizing him and diminishing himself. And Leo? He didn't become a musician or a luthier. That day on stage sparked a different, more analytical passion in him. He became fascinated not by the soul of music, but by its body. The physics of sound, how waves travel, how the geometry of a space can alter a note. He graduated with honors in acoustic engineering and became one of the world's most renowned concert hall designers. A man known for creating spaces where music could breathe, where even the most subtle of sighs could be heard with crystalline clarity. He spent his entire life ensuring that other voices of the forest, created by other honest artisans, would have the chance to be heard with the perfection they deserved. And in every project he designed, there was a silent tribute to the day a child's voice was the only acoustic that mattered. If this story about the courage of a father and son moved you in some way, your like shows us that we're on the right track, telling the stories that truly matter. Let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. Seriously, I read them all, and I make a point to personally reply with care to everyone who takes a moment to comment and share their energy. And if you believe in the power of stories like this, which prove that true value is priceless, subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. The channel is just starting out, and every new subscription gives me the fuel and the certainty to continue this journey. I'm really counting on your help. Don't go just yet. Choose one of the 2 stories I've left on the screen for you to watch next. I'll see you in the next video.